Thank you all for joining us for this Georgetown Dialogues Initiative event. Let me say just a brief word about what the Georgetown Dialogues Initiative is about, and then make some introductions, and we'll get on with the event. The Georgetown Dialogues Initiative was launched this year with the goal of generating and thinking about and encouraging productive dialogue across difference. As the interim president was just saying a few minutes ago to our guest, not debate, but dialogue, ways in which we can exchange ideas and learn from each other in the process of truly listening to each other on what are sometimes challenging issues about which there is good-natured disagreement about how we should approach a certain issue. The Dialogues Initiative has had kind of three threads this year. There are courses that are being taught this semester by faculty who have worked with candles to prepare themselves for how to encourage dialogue within their classrooms. Some of those courses co-taught by faculty, doing that within the context of their classroom. We have a cohort of first-year seminar faculty who have met in the fall throughout that first semester and thought about ways in which they could encourage this type of dialogue among their first-year students, and we'll be expanding that program going into the fall. And then the third thread are these types of public events where we bring together experts within a field to demonstrate dialogue in action, and hopefully all of us can learn from not just the substance of what they're talking about, but also the way in which they talk about it with each other. So we're grateful that you're here. Let me make two introductions. Following me, the interim president, Bob Groves, will provide a further welcome, and then he'll turn it over to Professor Joanna Lewis of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program in the School of Foreign Service, who will introduce our speakers and explain a bit more the structure of the event. So, President Groves.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You can hear me in the back? It is my pleasure to welcome you here. Every time we do another edition of the Georgetown Dialogues Initiative, I feel like we're executing our mission. And we have a treat for you today with Emily Domenech and Jigar Shah on environment and policy. I thank you for being here. Let me also, before I say more, thank David for all of his work as Vice Provost for Education, launching the Dialogues Initiative, but he, you may know, will become our new Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences in the summer, and we're thankful for everything he's done. And then I want to thank the co-sponsors of this event. These events just don't happen. They require a lot of work behind the scenes. The Earth Commons, led by Dean Peter Mara. Do you want to stand up, Pete? And STIA, the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program, directed by Professor Joanna Lewis, who is here and who will speak right after me. Finally, I want to thank our guests, Emily and Jigar. Emily is currently the Senior Vice President at Boundary Stone Partners, which is an energy and technology consulting firm. Prior to that role, Emily served as Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Speaker of the House, where she supported past Speaker Kevin McCarthy and most recently Speaker Mike Johnson, who sat in that chair, Emily, a few weeks ago. Jigar co-hosts the Open Circuit podcast that you might have heard, which explores the energy transition through policy, business, finance, and media lenses. Under the Biden administration, he directed the Loans Program Office at the Department of Energy, which invests in large-scale clean energy and advanced transportation projects across the country. Emily and Jigar, thank you so much for taking time out of schedules that are crazy, I know, to be here with us. We thank you for providing an example of civil dialogue. Let me say a few more things about the Georgetown Dialogues Initiative. Isn't that ironic? Our mission at Georgetown, if you read our mission statement, how many people in this audience have read the Georgetown mission statement? Well, at least 10. There's a sentence in there that I urge you to reread. We believe in the principle that serious and sustained dialogue among people of different faiths, cultures, and beliefs promotes intellectual, ethical, and spiritual understanding. That's what we do here. We cannot learn, I would assert. None of us can learn. We cannot make progress at discovering the truth unless we expose ourselves to different perspectives. In fact, universities might as well close if we can't entertain alternative ways of thinking. And you're here today to see a display of that and hopefully to learn from that, and that's why we mounted this initiative. One of the ways we accomplish this is through dialogue. Dialogue requires trying out for yourself, seeking out different perspectives. It requires listening, really active listening, asking questions in your own mind. And as the Jesuits call the notion of presupposition, assuming the other person is acting in goodwill. So we are at our best when we allow ourselves to encounter challenging ideas, things that we never would have thought of on our own. We engage in dialogue with people across different backgrounds, and the more different they are from us, the better. And we build bridges through that dialogue of understanding. So this Dialogues initiative for you has provided and will provide over the coming years rich opportunities for you to pick up these skills. And this is just one more example of our commitment to that. So I thank our speakers for their participation in the event, and I thank especially you in the audience for coming and learning from them. And I hope you enjoy your time together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone to this important dialogue on powering the future. I think we're really at a crucial time in history. It's the pivotal decade to make energy decisions which will impact our planet for the decades to come. Renewable energy sources are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in most parts of the world. We see the expansion of emerging technologies and applications like AI creating challenges in electricity demand growth, while also offering new opportunities for clean energy applications. The leaders in the development of clean energy technologies and innovation have also shifted from countries like the United States, Europe, and Japan to China. And this is raising concerns about the diversity and resilience of clean energy supply chains around the world. And then, of course, in the United States, the Trump administration is trying to usher in a new era of fossil fuel development, just as the Biden administration's policies were encouraging new clean energy facilities to locate in the United States. So to discuss these issues and many more, we are thrilled to have two energy experts here today, Emily Domenech and Jigar Shah. So thank you both so much for being here today for this important conversation. I think we're going to dive right in. And I thought to start us off, let's take a look at where each of you see the state of energy technology and energy investments today. What's your global view of the direction that we're heading in terms of specific technologies, nuclear, solar, others? And what's driving investment decisions, and particularly the role of the public versus the private sector? Jigar, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks for having me. You know, we're at a particularly interesting time where everything has been brought clearly into focus, right? Like today, everyone thinks about AI and the dominance of AI as important to the GDP of the United States. It is very obvious that there is actually no way to bring energy abundance to AI without clean energy. since 93% of everything ready to be constructed this year is clean, right? And anything that, people want to do that's not clean is like, the supply chain's not there. It might take till 2030 to be able to build those things. And so we're in this unique moment where it's not just the US that's facing this, but countries around the world have realized this, right? So when Pakistan was denied access to reliable electricity, people took it upon themselves to import 11 gigawatts of solar panels without anyone knowing it and figuring out how to get themselves clean electricity. They could have imported 11 gigawatts of diesel generators, but they didn't, right? And so you're in this weird spot right now where everyone knows that energy abundance comes from clean energy. Right? That it's harder and harder to find the oil and gas that we need. Getting to 120 million barrels a day, 140 million barrels a day is something that people are not actually predicting that we're going to get to, right? Certainly not oil and gas analysts. And so if you're in a place where you want to send a rocket to Mars, that you want to be an interplanetary species, you want to figure out how to have so much energy that you can do whatever it is that you want to do with it, everyone knows it has to be cleaned. Now, we have this commercialization pathway that has worked for solar, wind, battery storage, electric vehicles. It has not yet worked for geothermal, nuclear, the next generation of hydro technologies, right? What did we learn from the way in which solar, wind, battery storage, et cetera, were commercialized? Is there a way for us to get geothermal, nuclear, next generation hydro, the next set of technologies that will create this energy abundance ready for us? I think so. I think there's actually a lot of lessons that we've learned. The real question, though, is what are those lessons? And are they actually things that everyone agrees on? And then can we align policy such that those lessons can get executed so that we can get on with taking America's best and brightest innovators and supporting them to commercialize their technologies here? Because what happened in the last go-around, as Joanna was suggesting, was that we decided not to commercialize our technologies here. We decided to invent them here and then decided to send them to other continents to get commercialized. Why? Because we just had no interest in industrial strategy, right? Today, I think we have one version of industrial strategy. That's the Inflation Reduction Act and the work that was done over the last 4 years. And now we're being introduced to a new version of industrial strategy. And we'll see whether it actually brings about the investments that people are suggesting are needed to commercialize that technology here, or whether it actually drives our global competitors to work together without us to commercialize those technologies. And that, I think, is what's on the table today.
So I want to start with sort of two things. One thing I agree with, and two things maybe I don't. One, I think everyone here in this room can agree that if we're going to meet the energy demands of the future, we have to make investments across the spectrum of energy that's available to us. And that's going to be making choices that are focused on the reliability, the resiliency, the availability, and the affordability of that energy source. We have to be able to consider those things, 4 things. The 2 things that I would perhaps take issue with is something that I think we hear a lot here. We know this is happening. We know this transition is going this way. We know we're seeing more growth in clean energy. Sure, we're seeing some of that growth. But how much of that growth is being driven by a top-down federal policy that only exists here in the United States, that doesn't exist particularly in the developing world? And how much of that is being driven by actual, true bringing down the cost of that technology? I think oftentimes I love it when I hear that sort of, solar and wind are cost competitive with fossil fuels in the market. Well, they're cost competitive because in some cases they have a direct production tax credit, and because we're not considering the cost of the backup power and the cost of the transmission. We need to be looking at all of those things together if we're going to have an honest discussion about what's the best source of power and the most affordable source of power for us going forward. I think the other place where this tends to fall apart is when we take it from the macro, which is hey, look, we see market trends, we see the technology doing well, we see places where investments have made a difference, where tax credits have opened doors, and what does that mean for the average consumer in a given country? I think while it's all well and good, and we heard it from a lot of people, the IRA was a big success story, we've seen investments going in, we're building new projects. That didn't translate to bringing down costs for regular Americans, which is frankly why we saw the election outcome we saw this last November. And I think as people who care about advocating for energy policy and looking for ways to explore making sure it's easier to build all kinds of energy here in the United States, we have to be honest about that disconnect between the prices that people see in their electric bill and the sort of macro across the country, we're bringing down this cost of this new technology. I also want to sort of look ahead to sort of what our future problems are. You mentioned, we've got supply chain backlogs for natural gas projects. Nuclear continues to have significant permitting challenges here in this country. Those are things that were created over time and created over policies where they said, hey, natural gas is bad, we don't want to export it, we don't want to produce it, and we don't think you should make investments, which is what we saw in the last 4 years. In the case of nuclear, there's decades of pushback against nuclear projects, both from the environmental left and from folks who thought it was simply too expensive on the other side. So I think in order to be able to fix those kinds of permitting problems that make it difficult not just to build nuclear and natural gas, but to build solar and wind and geothermal and every other kind of energy under the sun, we have to have an honest conversation about what the barriers are to building in the United States. And I think that kind of brings us back around to where many in the Trump administration look at their energy policy. When they say, we want to have a policy of abundance, they want to make it easier to build in the United States. And that means talking about our entire regulatory structure, not just throwing money at the problem, which I think is where we often default to in the energy space.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thesis, one that I think the Republicans don't actually believe it, but I appreciate the projection of it. Like, I think we're in a situation right now where we did try to get rid of solar and wind tax credits. If you remember, in the 2015 oil export ban compromise, we actually started the process.
We can't get rid of them now, though, right? Because that would destroy the industry.
I am on record to phase them out. I mean, I started that trend in 2012. I think the real question, though, around that is it still would win, right? 93% of everything ready to be built is still clean, right? So it's not about it'll be built at a higher price, right? Obviously, because you get rid of the tax credit and the cash flows still have to cash flow. I think the bigger challenge is figuring out how you attract investors to your vision of the world, right? So at the time at which you decide that you want to get rid of all the regulations around nuclear, which I think we did a lot of work to get the Vance Act passed and other things to get that done, right? I don't think that that's actually what's holding back nuclear power, right? What's holding back nuclear power is the risk sharing around utilities and whether they want to take that risk, or whether it's the developers, whether they want to take the risk, or whether it's private equity firms, they want to take the risk, right? The government certainly is not raising its hand to take the risk on their side, right? And so I think one of the big challenges that we have is that we're in this position where I think folks, try to bring some sort of ideological coherence to what it is that they're talking about, which is great. But ultimately, what I care about as somebody who's a builder, right, is actually the outcome, like building a nuclear reactor, right? I love the fact that people want to argue about it over here and over here. But I think if you talk to the industry, what they will say is that the work that we did on the liftoff reports, on crowding in private sector capital, et cetera, made enough sense that $150 billion a year got crowded in, right? The question is whether the suite of solutions or policies, or whatever you want to call them, that we're now engaging with gets the same level of capital getting crowded in, right? And my sense is that you'll find that existing industries will be able to crowd in capital, and new industries will continue to then go to other countries to get commercialized.
I think particularly on the nuclear question, I think it's a great case study here because we're kind of going to see it play out in the administration's approach to AI. They put out a report 2 weeks ago that said, hey, look, we're going to look at co-locating data centers on federal land. That's not a coincidence. That's because, as you know, DOE has the ability to self-regulate reactor development, and they can build them much quicker than you can build them in the private sector. It's part of why we've seen some of these advanced reactor companies come up in that DOE universe from legislation I worked on a decade ago that gave DOE that explicit authority. So we're kind of going to get to test this case, right? Does Amazon care enough about ensuring that they have 24/7 clean power to co-locate a data center at a national lab so that they can build a reactor in 5 years instead of 15? That's an interesting case study. And I think you make a great point about, following the capital, right? Where are people going to make these investments? And in the nuclear space, like I remember a decade ago talking to TerraPower and the Bill Gates folks, and they said, the only place we can really develop our reactor is overseas. And so we're going to do it overseas because we can't do it here in the United States because of that regulatory burden. So I think.
But it's not because of the regulatory burden, right? It's because.
I mean, that's what they said at the time.
Right, but their actions speak louder than words, right? Bill Gates refuses to put the money in to finish the TerraPower reactor in Wyoming, right? He doesn't want to take the cost overrun risk. He wants Rocky Mountain Power to take it. Rocky Mountain Power has said, I'm not willing to take it. Then he's saying, can the federal government take it? And the federal government's like, we're not in that business.
But a good chunk of that risk comes from that regulatory uncertainty.
I would suggest to you that that's not true.
We shouldn't pretend that the fact that you don't know how long it will take to get a permit to build your project doesn't impact risk.
No. I hear you, but I don't think that that's true. I think, in general, when you look at the data, the NRC has withering regulation. Completely agree with you. And we've got to figure out a way to fix that, right? But that costs a lot more money on the front end,
Certainly.
right? At the time at which you get permission to start construction, it doesn't actually reduce those risks. And those are the things that, I think the US has to learn how to do big things again. And in the nuclear space, you've got a lot of people looking at each other with a lot of doubt around whether they can take those risks.
I'm going to jump us off the issue of nuclear, but
we can
let's
talk
come
about
back to
nuclear all
that,
day,
because this is a really important conversation. Let's turn to the broader geopolitics of energy decisions. You've already started to touch on some, but I'm curious, particularly, do you see a growing emphasis on energy security in this day and age as nations start to think about their own energy decarbonization landscape? So looking now not just in the United States. And what does competition look like, as countries are sort of positioning themselves to compete? And particularly, the issue, I think, of diversifying away from China, right, and their sort of dominance in a lot of supply chains in the clean energy space is, something that has had bipartisan support, over the last few years. I'd be curious to hear, both of your thoughts on this area.
Yeah, I would say I think energy security almost means something different than it did 10 or 15 years ago, where before it was really, really focused on this, what's your ability to produce a domestic XYZ, be it oil and gas, be it, in your, looking at a country like Denmark, your ability to power your grid based on mostly wind. And now I think it has really come back to this, where do the raw materials come from question? What is your whole supply chain from start to finish? And with a particular emphasis on concern over not just what is truly produced in China, but what is controlled by China. I think our critical mineral markets are a wonderful example of something where China doesn't particularly own or produce the raw materials, but they have the processing capacity almost entirely locked up, be it through their Chinese factories or their subsidiaries in other parts of Asia. And they have the ability to flood the market to a point where it becomes impossible to get investment to do something somewhere else. And I think that is something that, I think, it's true in many other markets besides energy, but we see it most critically here because we are going through this space where there's a lot of growth in the areas that China has put in the hard work to control. And two, I think it again pushes us back to this question of how do we determine the value of the energy source? Is it as valuable an energy source if the supply chain can get turned on or off by China? A similar conversation to what we used to have. I think we don't have quite nearly as much today, but the conversation that we used to have about OPEC perhaps in the 90s. So I think that supply chain mindset is really what is driving policymakers to think about how do we make it easier to not just mine in the United States, but actually do mineral processing and lead into a supply chain that's here and in the, in a right shored or reshored, depending on how you want to look at it. But thinking about that whole supply chain, I think, is really the driving factor. And it's why you see some of the legislation on Capitol Hill coming out of not the energy committees, but the China Select Committee has done more work on the critical mineral supply than any committee on the Hill. So I think it's really a reshaping of both the people who are engaged in this policy and sort of how you're looking at it from start to finish.
Yeah, I think, so Carlisle put a paper out recently called the New Jewel Order. And really what it says is that for a lot of countries for many years, I mean, China and India in particular, but lots of other global south countries, energy security was the driving force for them on solar, on everything else, right? Because for them, they were spending, in India's case, $167 billion last year importing fossil fuels. And they're saying, instead of importing fossil fuels, we'd rather make stuff here, like produce stuff here, et cetera. That includes coal, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for them, local was more important than imports, right? The US had a similar point of view, right, in the rhetoric around we don't want to be importing oil, we want to be energy independent, right? So that stuff also matters. I think in China's case, they were the fastest growing importer of oil in the world in the noughts, right? And so then starting in 2010, they decided that they were going to stop really growing their imports of oil. And so they started, ratcheting up electric vehicles. And so as a result of their need to feed their electric vehicle industry, they decided to go out and secure the critical minerals space, right? And we sort of let them do it because even though we knew it was happening, we weren't sure that we cared, right? And now we're in a place where we do care, right? But all the easy to get critical minerals facilities are kind of taken, and there's plenty of critical minerals in the world, to be clear, right? So we're not short critical minerals, but we have to spend the 10 years to get it, bring it to market, do the processing, all the things that we want to do. And then the question really becomes what are the signals, again, that we're sending to capital markets, right? So if one of the best supplies of graphite are in Mozambique, do we actually want that graphite? Because right now we have control of that graphite through Cyber Resources, but we're not saying that whether we want it or we don't want it, right? Or in Argentina or other places. And now we're saying, actually, not only are we not going to tell you whether we want it or not want it, we're going to slap a random 46% tariff on you because of some weird ChatGPT spreadsheet that we created. And so we're now in a weird spot where they're getting mixed signals, right? And so we're saying we want to diversify critical minerals away from just China. Again, we're not necessarily saying that we're anti-China, at least I'm not, but we're saying that we don't want them to have a dominant control over this thing that's really important to us. And so we want a diversification of resources. Like China, we're in the same place where we have a lot of lithium, but we don't necessarily have a lot of natural sources of nickel or cobalt or some of the other things. And so we're going to need other countries in our camp. And where we're headed right now with, I think, the tariff battle that's coming out today is that I think the president is going out and saying, you're either with us or against us, right? And China, I'm assuming, is going to do the same thing and is going to say, you're either with us or against us. And one of my big challenges on the geopolitics side is that I don't know exactly what countries are deciding around whether they're with us or against us on. I think China has a very coherent story, which I think is not, frankly, very compelling to many of those countries, but it's coherent. And then we're saying, well, we randomly put this tariff on penguins because we didn't realize that only penguins live there. And we're not sure what our strategy is going to be in 3 months' time, right? And so it's not clear what people are choosing. They don't want to choose China because China doesn't have a great reputation for partnerships with other countries, but they're not sure what they're signing up for with us, right? And so part of the thing that bothers me the most about this moment is that China is clearly in the best position to help everyone implement Carlyle's New Dual Order, right? They clearly have overcapacity. They can flood the market with product. They can get a lot more market share. But they're actually weak in this moment. The Belt and Road Initiative didn't work out very well for them. And they don't know that they want to finance a lot of the purchase of their equipment for a lot of these countries, right? And so they're in a very weak position. We have the ability to take market share away from China, but I don't think we've actually decided what we want to do. And so countries are left going, do we need to work with the US? And weirdly, the group that probably would be the strongest group to take advantage of both China's weakness and the US's weakness is the EU, and they're a complete basket case. And
we certainly can agree on that.
we're in this weird spot, right, where all these countries are clearly we want to use clean energy to get to where we want to go because it's a one-time purchase. Once we purchase it, we can produce clean electrons forever. But they're not being given a lot of term sheets around here's the group that you should partner with.
I just want to also sort of to go back to the energy framework here. part of why China has been able to control the critical mineral market is because they have no problem using coal to process it. And I think that is something we should acknowledge when we look at our supply chains. If the goal is to reduce global emissions, and we're driving a lot of manufacturing capacity and driving a lot of processing capacity into the countries who don't care about that part of the goal, then are we really making progress in the direction that we want?
Right, but what are you suggesting? I mean, I think that
offshoring our emissions doesn't solve the global emissions problem. And so I think that's something we should consider when we look at the kinds of policies that we embrace.
Sure, but that was chosen by Reagan and supported by every president since then, right? And so now we're deciding to reverse course on that. But coal, I mean, for better or for worse, you can build a new coal plant today if you wanted to. You could even eviscerate EPA regulations to try to get that done. It's still $95 a megawatt hour. Nobody wants new coal at $95 a megawatt hour. So it sort of is what it is. I think the problem that we have today is not that people are anti-coal. The problem that we have is that all of our existing coal plants are 45 years old, and so they're hitting the end of life. Utilities are being asked, do you want to put another $1 billion into extending its life for 12 years? And they're saying, not at $95 a megawatt hour, I don't.
No, I don't take this as me advocating for we need to build more U.S. coal here in the United States. I think really the answer is if we're talking about a goal of a cleaner economy, then we have to acknowledge where the emissions, if we move them out of the United States, they still exist. And I think that's something that's often missing in this discussion about how much does it cost to bring these supply chains back into a place where we can say, actually, we do know it's being done in a way that's environmentally responsible, not just on greenhouse gas emissions, but on particulate matter and all of the other sort of criteria emissions as well.
Oh, I would agree with that. I mean, but part of that is also trying to figure out if we're going to friendshore, who our friends are. Right? I mean, part of the policy over the last few days have, I think, confirmed that Canada and Mexico are still our friends, but I'm not quite sure. And then, the question is, what do we do with India? I don't understand exactly why the tariffs are on India. And then, magically Russia was sort of exempted from tariffs. Are we deciding that they're going to be our best trading partner? I just don't understand what market signals the capital markets are supposed to take from the first 70 plus days of this administration, right? And so we're in this place where I'm not judging. I really am not. Because as somebody who's a builder and have been a builder my whole life, all I see today is opportunity, right? Out of chaos, all I see is opportunity just because that's the way my mind works. And so it's great, whether it's the EOS battery factory that we built in Pittsburgh, which uses all domestic supply chains, or whether it's other things that we've done. Those folks are going to, I think, be very successful. Q-Cells is doing quite well in Dalton and others to onshore their supply chain as well. I just, the thing that bothers me the most is that we have done 40 plus years of extraordinary research to the point where we have all the best technologies in the world. And China doesn't have that, right? But we can't deny those people access to monetizing their inventions, right? So if we're not going to commercialize them here, and we're not going to allow friend-shoring countries to commercialize them, they all end up in China. That is what happens. These companies go bankrupt, and then in the auction process, China ends up buying them. And the first Trump administration is the group that actually approved all the CFIUS approvals for lithium-ion battery technology to go to China. And so we're in this weird spot where I want us to win, but I don't think that the policies that you're describing on a macro basis give me any indications of what I'm supposed to be doing differently.
Can I use that as a
Sure,
jumping
go ahead.
off
Yeah.
point for another set of issues I wanted you guys to touch on? And then for everyone in the audience, please start to think about your questions, because we're going to be opening this up very shortly. So, you mentioned that you're sort of, there's a lot of opportunities out there, and we've also sort of touched on if you sort of do energy policy without climate policy, you might have a sort of different set of decision points, right? If you're just getting clean energy technologies out there, but it's all driven by coal, right? You're not necessarily achieving the goals. Given everything we've discussed here today, I'd be interested to hear sort of where you each see the United States is headed. I mean, what is the plan? What is the opportunity for the United States, for our companies, and whether it's sort of the future of Biden-era policies, like the IRA, which was arguably the sort of the most impactful climate policy the United States has ever done. Not clear sort of what will become of it. And then I'd be curious also to hear what else might be coming down the pipeline in Congress or elsewhere? You know, what are policymakers thinking right now about the U.S. energy future?
So maybe I'll start with the IRA because I think it's a good way to think about sort of what has worked and resonated with both sides of the aisle. A place where I think the IRA did right is in the space of how do we incentivize manufacturing here in the United States. And I say did right because I think that's something that appeals to particularly the populist-leaning arguments that come out of the Trump administration that are really focused on that right-shoring, reshoring of manufacturing capability. And I think we've seen factories get built and moving ahead entirely because of that credit. I actually think that I make this joke a lot that if you wanted me to be able to sell part of the IRA to JD Vance, I would say we should take 45X and apply it to more industries. It's a case study in the clean energy space that could potentially be used to incentivize some of the things that I think their intention is to incentivize with the tariff regime. And I think you could perhaps argue that a tax credit that was incorporated into that policy would make more sense. It's part of why I think 45X is probably the safest out of that space of new tax credits that came from the IRA. On the other end, I think you probably see the most vulnerable part of the IRA, which is that sort of tail end of the supply chain, the consumer-driven credits for EVs, particularly 30D. That, I think, has the most problems because you can dislike it for a lot of reasons. If you're from middle America and an EV doesn't make sense for you, you can dislike it because you feel like it's just going to the coastal elites. If you are somebody who cares a lot about China being in our supply chain, you can dislike it because you can still get really far down the supply chain before there's a domestic content requirement, and we all know that much of that supply chain is controlled by China. If you just don't like EVs, you can dislike it for that reason. Or frankly, if you're a biofuels producer who put a lot of work into building out a biofuels infrastructure, you can dislike it because you think it's picking winners and losers in the sort of cleaner, better alternative space, whether you agree with that or not. So I think that's part of why it's the most vulnerable, because it really is sort of disconnected from where you see people think about their, what does this look like on a daily basis, and it's disconnected sort of for those macro policymakers. I think if clean energy advocates were to sort of take a lesson away from the IRA, it's that if you want your policies to be resilient, passing them in one big bill with the reconciliation process where not a single person from the other side is involved makes you more vulnerable next time the parties switch places. And it's a bad way to do policy, and we both do it. So we all recognize that it makes things more volatile and more difficult for investors in the long run because you have these changing policies. I think we'll probably come out the other side where much of the IRA stays intact, or perhaps stays intact in some way, shape, or form, and that may be a boon for investors, but I think it's a good example of why this sort of 4-year flip-flopping policies is really bad for everyone. In terms of things I'm positive about, and we can talk more about this going forward because I think it's something we share, is I do think there is huge opportunity for changing the way that we do permitting here in the United States in the Trump administration and in this moment where we have very strong executive branch interest in changing permitting reform across the board. We have strong advocates in Congress who are interested in making that permitting reform lasting so that it doesn't change from the first day of this administration to the next one. And then I think we have a coalition of folks, particularly in the clean energy space, who represent a group of people on the left who are a little bit new to the permitting really sucks party, and I think are coming around from that sort of legacy environmentalist view, which was building things is bad. We are now in a place where if you care about the climate, if you care about a robust economy, building things has to be good, and building things in the United States has to be good. So it's changed that political dynamic in a way that I think makes it possible for us to maybe actually make it better for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with Emily. Look, I think we're in this weird place where for a long time, doing industrial strategy was a 4-letter word, right? I mean, certainly Jason Furman embarrassed himself in foreign affairs over this issue. But I think we're in this weird spot where the Biden administration put forward their version of industrial strategy, right? 30D was a part of it. Part of the reason 30D was so important was because we not only have a supply side, sort of support mechanism for critical minerals here in the United States, but also there's a demand side piece through the domestic content piece in 30D. And so a lot of the automakers and a lot of the battery manufacturers were buying domestically sourced critical minerals, even if they were more expensive, because they couldn't access the 30D tax credit unless they bought enough of those, right? And so the question becomes, if those 30D tax credits go away, like, will the local battery manufacturers stop buying domestically sourced critical minerals, right? And then if you decide, well, the way we're going to solve that problem is by putting tariffs on importing materials, right? Is that enough of a stable signal? To Emily's point, like, you know, tariffs might flip-flop every 4 years, right? And so is that enough of a stable signal to get people to invest in critical minerals processing here in the United States, right? These are all important questions that don't have easy answers, right? The Biden administration put together its form of draft, right, that was passed. The Republicans are now going to be in power such that they should be able to adjust it, right? And it sounds like you're suggesting that it probably will be adjusted as opposed to tossed out the door. But I think the goal of it always has to be crowding in private sector capital. And it's a very difficult conversation to have, because I think part of what Emily's saying, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, so you should feel free to correct me, is that there are things other than just crowding in private sector capital that people are solving for. There are also some cultural issues and other issues around, you know, whether people believe that there's an EV mandate, whether they believe that, like, they're being forced into an EV, and all these other things. And I think that those things are very dangerous for us to be fomenting, because we're in a place where the US has the best technology in the world. We have a unique opportunity to seize on that, right? Just to give you an example, since 2018, we have 2,000 companies in the United States that are best in class that receive venture capital, right? Those companies have made it through whatever stage gates they need to make it through to figure out whether they are going to commercialize their technology here today. Probably 500 of them have made it to that position. Many of them got grants out of the Manufacturing Electricity Supply Chain Office, or the Grid Deployment Office, or the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or the Loan Programs Office. The Loan Programs Office seems to have been spared in this moment, just because I think the administration believes that the Loan Programs Office will be important to their nuclear emissions and other emissions. But the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, I think, is being shut down, even though it came out of a bipartisan infrastructure law.
Bipartisan-ish, let's say that.
I mean, it was passed by,
we had 12 Republicans vote for it in the House, so it's a pretty small margin there.
I agree that Trump told everybody not to vote for it. But
not true. Not true.
I'm just saying that, like, the Senate was far more bipartisan, I thought, for the bill.
I think in this case it comes down to what do you think the role of government is in sponsoring a particular technology's success or failure. I would say, as somebody who worked on science policy and DOE-specific policy for a long time, most Republicans look at OSED, let's take this as a case study.
Yeah.
We look at it as should the Department of Energy be involved in clean energy demonstrations? In some cases, yes. Do we need an OSED office and then demonstration offices in all of the applied offices kind of doing the same things? We would say no, because we would say either we want to have one centralized place where we do it, or we want our applied offices that focus on fossil or renewable, et cetera, to have that function. We don't want redundant federal government functions. And I think that's part of why OSED has gotten singled out here, is that it was seen by many Republicans as sort of a redundant office. That said, I would say, having had many conversations with folks who are in DOE today, the perspective they are taking when they look at the OSED grants is, will this technology be cost competitive after the grant is over? So will the DOE, not are they cost competitive today before we give them the money, because I think that's kind of a high bar to set.
Right.
But are we actually moving the needle with this demonstration effort so that we are making real progress and not putting ourselves in a position where we're just going to be asked, hey, actually, you know what, that first 100 million was just the first 100 million I needed. I really need another 100 million in order to make this work, and again and again and again. Because I love that you say you've been supportive of phasing out the tax credits, but it's a great example of something where you're in the minority on that, because most people come back and say, look, we just need permanent policy.
Well,
and
Grassley's
so,
in the minority on that, right? I mean,
Certainly.
Grassley's the reason it keeps getting extended. Look, I think one of my challenges here is that when you think about what China has accomplished today uniquely, where they can steal our technology and then figure out how to commercialize it in record time and has all of the different pieces in order to get it commercialized, OSED is a part of that, right? When you look at the demonstrations that are happening in the Office of Nuclear Energy or the Battery Office or the Solar Office, they by definition have 90% failure rates. Right? 90% of everything that they give a grant to doesn't make it to the next stage, right? And so like this is not the group that you would trust to take the 500 companies that have gone through the venture capital community to commercialization. If it's not the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which was trying to bring the smartest people throughout DOE into one place who knew how to do that thing, then like it's got to be something else. But reverting it back to the Office of Nuclear Energy that loves their science projects is not how I want nuclear to be commercialized, right? And so like one of the big challenges I have is I get the fact that like there's a lot of people who just want to cut because for whatever reason that's the mode that we're in today, but I want to build, right? And so the question becomes, for the innovators and entrepreneurs in this country, what signal are we sending them? What are we telling them the US government is doing for them so that they enthusiastically embrace our country? Because if they don't, and if we don't, like I'm sure that the UK and the EU are all over our website right now trying to figure out who got grants and loans and get them to come over to the EU or the UK. I'm sure Australia is all in with their $1 billion like announcement on Thursday, right? And so like I don't want to lose all these folks to other countries. I just don't. Not after we did all the work to like figure out how to get them through R&D.
I'm going to pause us for just a moment, and because we're getting close to the end of our time, and I want to make sure we have lots of time to engage with the audience. There's 2 microphones set up on each side, so I'm going to encourage folks to go ahead and line up and get your questions ready. And while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to just add my quick 2 cents on something that was said. You know, I think China didn't just steal other people's technologies. You know, they really have shifted now to a place where I think, you know, we see evidence that they're starting to innovate, particularly in the battery and EV sector. And I think it's worth thinking, though, about the industrial policy model, sort of what worked there and what didn't, and sort of how now all countries are thinking about how to best position themselves in this clean energy transition, because nobody wants to be sort of just the extractive industry, right? Or just the importer of whether
you're in the extractive industry, whether you're building clean energy or not. You're still extracting minerals from the ground, so we are still doing
but I'm saying
extractive work
if
to
the
do that.
only sort of role that you're playing, right, is the sort of lowest value added in terms of benefiting your economy, right? Because I think countries want to all benefit, right?
You want to have a manufacturing-based economy.
That's the proposition.
I think. And I think that's where, again, it becomes down to the goal is really similar in many places. I think the question that often separates us is, one, what's the role of the federal government? And is it the federal government's job to decide who gets to succeed and who doesn't? And should they have that ability? And then I think the second thing comes down to what is it that we're trying to build here? Are we trying to build a core manufacturing base, or are we going to pick and choose which industries are most important and really focused on right-shoring those industries?
No, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to go over here.
Because there's a longer line over there.
Yeah, exactly, so we can get through. Yeah, if you're smart, go to that side. I'm just kidding. We'll get as many as we can. Please just briefly introduce yourself with your question, and try to keep them short so we can get as many as possible.
Hi, my name is Arjun. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Georgetown University. So my question is, in the starting of the discussion, you guys talked about how we need energy abundance, but you guys had a little bit different understanding or points about how cheap clean energy is. So I wanted to bring the point back there. Is clean energy, given all the, even taking into account all the subsidies or the tax credits, is it generally cheaper than the fossil fuels? And what would you guys say about that?
I would answer that it is, in the places where it's abundant, it's cheaper at the spot price. It's not always cheaper when we're incorporating the whole life cycle and the backup. It's part of why we talked about this on our pre-call, where there's some gas projects in Texas that investors have pulled back from those projects because they don't see them as being cost competitive. Well, the reason they're not cost competitive is because they're asking those gas projects to only run like 10% of the time as a peaker plant. It doesn't make a lot of sense to build a huge facility and then only run it 10% of the time, but we need that backup power in order to be able to make the renewable boom that has happened in Texas because of their, frankly, very investment-friendly economy, make that possible. So I think we have to be thinking about not just the cost of the electricity in the moment, when it's the prime moment. We have to think about what it costs when it isn't there. I'd also add here that we have a huge disconnect between the amount of battery capacity we have in the United States States versus the amount of renewable capacity we have in the United States. If we really want to get to a place where we can take advantage of that cheap renewable cost, that metric has to change.
Thank you.
No worries.
Hi, I'm Tim Bartley. I'm a professor here in the Earth Commons and Department of Sociology. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you delving into a lot of details and finding some common grounds as well as some points of disagreement. But I'm really struck that the big picture hasn't come out as clearly as I imagined it would. And there's two words I don't think have been mentioned in the entire conversation, which are, of course, climate change.
Oh, no, I said it.
And I guess I just wanted to ask, like, what's your personal position on human-induced climate change? And to what extent do you think that structures the policy priorities of the people that you work with and of the political leaders that you've been discussing?
I assume this question's for me, right? So I've worked in energy and climate policy for a long time. I helped run the Republicans' Energy, Climate, and Conservation Task Force. We have a 100-member conservative climate caucus that includes a bunch of members of Congress who are Republicans who are all perfectly comfortable saying the climate is changing and a man has absolutely influenced it. I think, however, where we differentiate from each other is what's the role of government in solving that problem? Can we solve it with only government intervention, or do we need to allow for more opportunity in the marketplace? And two, what does winning look like? I think most of the Republicans that I've worked with in my experience as a staffer are really concerned about the idea that we're only going to focus on U.S. emissions and we don't think about the global big picture. It's part of where this China is still building a new coal plant every 5 or 6 days thing matters. If we're only looking at using climate as a metric for how we look at domestic policy, it doesn't make a lot of sense in the big picture. So I think that's where we often differentiate, is that viewpoint on how we engage.
I mean, I think what I'd add is just that, I mean, I've worked on climate change for a long time. Certainly believe it's real. I think, but I don't think I've ever used a climate-related argument in the way that I talk about things, because in general, I think that this is the largest wealth creation opportunity of the century. And ultimately, I think this is an energy security and local issue. And those are the things that I use to get India to the table, China to the table, Brazil to the table, South Africa to the table. So like, I think a lot of these guys are looking at this because it's a huge opportunity and it's a way for them to help control the means of energy production for themselves.
Yeah, also just to bring it back to that sort of micro level, like the average farmer who has an opportunity to deploy solar panels or wind turbines on their farm doesn't care about climate. They don't have the luxury of caring about it in the same way that we do here in Washington. They care about getting a revenue stream for their farm. And that value is frankly how we ever get to a place where we're doing different things.
Well, they care if rain precipitation patterns are changing and temperature.
But they don't wake up every day thinking about it the way we think about it. And that's what I mean here, is that they think about it as like, how do I get from day to day and get a revenue stream? They didn't invest in that solar panel because of climate change.
Let me go over here.
Hi, my name is Danielle, and I probably shouldn't be asking a question. My husband is a postdoc here, and I used to work at the Department of Energy in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. Hello. I worked there for 2 years. Hearing the perspective that there might be a thought that it could be redundant was also a bit shocking. I'll say that Jigar's right. When we were working at that office, it was a different risk space, right? Not just like technical risk, but the amount of capital that you're deploying is so much bigger that it might warrant its own office. That was the comment. But the question is, you mentioned deregulation. I am also now at an engineering firm, and I'm firmly with Jigar that I want to build. If we change permitting, and even judicial reform is wrapped up into that at the federal level, my main concern is that the states will now start to come up with their own regulations. When you take out the federal as the leader of the pack, the states will step in and start doing a lot of their own different regulations. And as somebody who now helps clients with those regulations, it makes replicability harder. When you're a developer, you can't just build and copy and paste across the states. So I'm all for federal deregulation, but it has an unintended consequence of actually diversifying the kind of state regulations. So what would you respond to that? Like,
I would respond to that by saying I think we have that now. Right now we have lots of different state regulations and we have a federal regulation scheme that make it difficult to build. We see that, for example, I spent a lot of time working on wildfire management in California. I used to work for a California member, so it's something that's near and dear to my heart. It's much more difficult to fight a wildfire in California, be it whether you're on federal land or state land, because of the regulatory burden that goes into the assessments you have to do in order to do any mitigation or clearing before that fire takes place. In Arkansas, it's a hell of a lot easier to fight that fire because you can actually effectively manage your forest as long as you're on private land. The second you step on federal land, you have that federal overreach, but you don't have that same problem at the state level. So I would say I think it's already happening, and taking away some of the federal burdens could perhaps expose the states that make it harder to build. If it's easier to build in Texas than it is in California, you're going to see more investment in Texas, and sometimes that's hidden under the existing regulatory burden that exists from the federal level.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is just that this is why I don't like the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson crap, because there's no theory of the case for them, right? The theory of the case for them is that high-speed rail didn't happen, and so I'm bitter. But I think I'll give you an example of what they leave unresolved. So if you look at the manufactured home industry in the United States, Arkansas, for instance, has these regulations that make the local inspector have to look at the home before you can live in it, which makes no sense. If you've already approved it at the manufacturing factory level, you shouldn't have another regulator at the local level, and that person's busy and they take 6 weeks to get there, et cetera. And so I don't actually understand how Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's view solves that problem, in the same way that I don't understand how the deregulation effort in the US Congress solves that problem. And so I just think we need a mindset shift in the United States around this precautionary principle stuff. This needs to be changed, right? We sort of don't do the precautionary principle in the FDA, and so all of us eat bad food. And then we do have it on this other stuff such that we can't build things. And there's just an entire theory of change that I need people like you to work on, and not, and academics to work on, which is missing. And this slicing this and slicing that doesn't seem like it's going to solve it.
I totally agree, and I think maybe looking at the way we permit on brownfield sites, for example, is a good place to start.
Totally.
Because we can make that argument really cohesively. This has been permitted. We have done things here before. We just want to make some changes, and I think that might be a place to explore that, particularly at the state level.
Awesome.
I have a colleague who's writing a large language model code, to basically apply to renewable energy permitting so that we could streamline everything.
I think that AI impacts on permitting are going to be incredibly significant because it allows you to actually make sense of the mess.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'm sorry, we probably only have time for one more, but we are having a reception after this right outside, and our speakers will stay and can chat with you all as well. So let me take one last question here.
Great, thanks. My name is Jutin. I work at the Loan Programs Office. Emily, I was not planted here by Jigar, I promise.
This is cheating.
Total cheating.
I do want to talk about abundance with you later. My question is around sort of what's the best case scenario for this? One case study I think of tariffs versus incentives is the solar manufacturing space. I'm sure you're familiar. We put tariffs on 100+% tariffs on China solar panels back in 2010, and we've had increasing tariffs across Southeast Asia, and all they've done is move their factories for the last 15 years until IRA, when we had 45X, which it seems like you like, and we have 50 gigawatts of solar assembly, and we're actually going to be self-sufficient on solar. So we had 12 years of lots of tariffs with very little solar manufacturing, and then once we get incentives, we get a burst of manufacturing, not just in solar and elsewhere. So given the current tariff regime, and if we can call this industrial strategy, what's the best case scenario? I want to believe that there is an end goal that is desirable, but given how complex these supply chains are, a lot of companies bought equipment from Spain instead of China because they thought it would be cheaper and untariffed. So our global supply chain is so complex, and we're trying to build these things here. What's the best case for the current strategy, and what's the vision there? How does that work?
I think if you're asking me to tell you what President Trump's vision is on tariffs, I'm the wrong person to ask. And I think actually we were just talking about this beforehand, that we've seen sort of some interesting dialogue between senior officials in the administration about what they think the end goal is. I think the prevailing thought among Republicans is that the goal is to get people to the table to negotiate deals around the world. I think that is, if you talk to 80% of Republicans, they'll tell you that's how they think about tariffs. I don't think that's true for everyone. I think there are some people who are in the Republican Party who think tariffs are a long-term solution because, frankly, we've been dealing with reciprocal tariffs from other countries for decades, and they have put us in this position where we've, overemphasized globalization, and we're at a place where we have a risk of losing our capacity to manufacture here in the United States, and in some cases have already lost it. So I think, frankly, we'll see that play out as we move forward. Is this going to be a scenario where we see President Trump cut the greatest 10 deals in a row with the best countries? That's the kind of thing we're going to see. Or are we going to see a situation where this is the new norm and we should expect a tariff-heavy regime going forward? I can't answer that question for you today, but I would say, again, most Republicans, I think, see it as a way to bring people to the table.
I can answer it for you. Smoot Hawley forever. No, I think... No, we're clearly in a place that doesn't make any sense. And frankly, Obama started it in 2012 with all the bullshit around the solar tariffs. And, the U.S. consumer has spent an extra 20 cents a watt ever since 2012 without a really coherent strategy around onshoring solar manufacturing. We finally put a coherent strategy in place during the Biden administration, and you got the Q-Cells facility, you got 50 megawatts worth of module manufacturing facilities now up and running in the United States, and hopefully they'll go to cell and ingot and do some of the other stuff. But I think that, just to put it in perspective for you, we were at roughly 2.2%, sort of collective tariffs on imports, right, sort of on Inauguration Day. I think, they immediately put the 10% tariff on everybody, right? I don't think that 10% tariff is going away, to be clear. I think we're all going to have 10% tariffs. Now you've got, all these building tariffs on top of it. The whole thing it doesn't make any sense. Our economy is so complex that it is not possible to make a 100% U.S. domestic content product. Not in a very complex industry like semiconductors or solar or electric vehicle batteries or whatever. At the very least, we need Mexico and Canada as part of that. And my sense is you're going to need a lot broader set of countries to be able to do that. And I don't really see how we move to a coalition of the willing within the current framework that is being negotiated right now. It's literally the most perplexing thing in front of us right now.
I really want to thank you both for taking on these really tough topics and these, and I know it can be sort of difficult to be sort of, going head to head on this, but I think you both are really the perfect people to talk about this with your experience, and I appreciate you both, really listening to each other and listening to the questions. I know we've all learned a lot here today, so thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. Please stay after, and please everyone join me in thanking our speakers.
I guess we're supposed to shake in front of the photo.
Are we doing a picture?
I think so.
All right, let's do it.
Should we have a fighting pose?
Yeah, do a little
Thank you.
thank you.